Gospel reading is John 6, 51 through 58, New Testament, page 98. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever, and the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. The Jews then disputed among themselves, saying, How can this man give us his flesh to eat? So Jesus said to them, Very truly, I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood have eternal life, and I will raise them up on the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so whoever eats me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven, not like that which your ancestors ate, and they died. But the one who eats this bread will live forever. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thank you. Thank you for reading. Janet. Appreciate that. In Michael Dobbs' book, titled The Fall of the Soviet Empire, Dobbs describes a tour of Houston by Russian President Boris Yeltsin. Now, this was just shortly before the Berlin Wall fell. This was in September of 1989. The wall would fall on December of 1989, but things were already in motion for that to happen. And this is what Dobbs describes what happened on his first ever trip to the United States. Here's how he writes it. A turning point in Yeltsin's intellectual development occurred during his first visit to the United States in September 1989. More specifically, his first visit to an American supermarket in Houston, Texas. The sight of aisle after aisle of shelves, neatly stacked with every conceivable type of food, each in a dozen varieties, both amazed and depressed him. On the plane, traveling from Houston to Miami, Yeltsin seemed lost in his thoughts for a very long time. He clutched his head in his hands. Eventually, he broke his silence. They had to fool people. They had to fool the people. And he's talking about his people. That's what he told his aide. Yeltsin's words explained why the Soviet Union made it so difficult for the average Soviet citizen to go abroad or to get any information from abroad. But in Houston, Yeltsin's eyes were opened to the abundance of the West. More importantly, he realized the deficiencies endured by his own country, which made him understand, really for the first time, the oppressive nature of their culture. He literally had no idea that it was like this. The president realized with the growing revolution in East Berlin that change was inevitable. And that actually may have contributed somewhat, supposedly, possibly, to his lack of resistance against the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Food can be both transformative and transcendent, nourishing not just the body, but the mind and the heart. Yeltsin's mind was open to seeing the truth and applying it to the life of his culture. The supermarket in Houston became a metaphor to Yeltsin, and it planted the seeds for what would eventually be one of the most incredible and astounding events in the history of the modern global society, global community, and that was the breakup of the Soviet Union. But some minds, as we know, cannot be opened by anything. In fact, food, or talking about food, can shut some minds, especially minds that cannot be opened beyond their assumptions. And that is the heart of this story from John in the gospel. Let me set it up. We don't know whether Christ had been invited to teach at that synagogue or was just having an open discussion with an unspecified group of Jewish leaders. Nor do we know which factions these leaders represented. John didn't tell us whether they're Pharisees, scribes, members of the local leaders of the local community, whatever. However, the context of Christ's words was more important than the fact that they were spoken in the synagogue. That really is not a main issue here. Let's go back to the beginning of chapter 6. At the beginning of chapter 6, Jesus fed 5,000 in the same way that we saw him feed crowds in the other gospels, same way. But in John's gospel, Jesus connected this miracle directly to the wilderness provision that God gave to Israel in the book of Exodus. You know that story, right? As they traveled toward the promised land, God provided manna, a white substance which the people were ordered to gather off the ground early in the morning. God, out of his love for his people, transformed the wasteland of the desert into a nourishing place. And Jesus did the same thing for the crowds that came to him in the desolate places where he taught. He did this not just because they were hungry, but because he wanted them to understand God's providence by the hand of God's Messiah. After Jesus' miracle, in that same chapter, the crowds followed him everywhere, begging him to provide more of the miraculous bread. Who wouldn't? I mean, what a wonderful thing. Get all you can eat, right? Jesus responded to their request by trying to make them understand the meaning of the miracle. Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures for eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. After Jesus' explanation that it was not Moses who fed the people in the wilderness, but God, the crowd said to him, "Sir, give us this bread always." And you'll remember how Jesus responded, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." Now, clearly, Jesus was talking about belief in him, belief as the means by which God would nourish and care for and save Israel. We know that. You can hear it, can understand that clearly. But sometimes afterwards, Jesus overheard an argument in the synagogue where he's teaching, this is later, among an unidentified group of Jewish leaders who were struggling with what Jesus had previously said to the crowd and probably had already said in the synagogue. Never one to avoid a teachable moment, Jesus interrupted their discussion and reiterated to them what he said earlier. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. And I'm assuming he pointed to himself. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world, the bread I will give for the life of the world, is my flesh. And as soon as they heard that word, things went south, as we say in the South. Things went south. The Jewish leaders who had been taught the literalism of God's law applied the same logic to Jesus' words, saying among themselves, "How can this man give us his flesh to eat?" He did not say he was going to give his flesh for them to eat, but that's what they heard. But what's interesting, Jesus not only did not try to explain his metaphor, he doubled down on it and carried it to an extreme that was offensive to his listeners and would later not only baffle his disciples, but in the early centuries of the church cause a lot of trouble for it. Very truly, I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so whoever eats me will live because of me. This, and then he slips into the symbolism. This is the bread that came down from heaven. The one who eats this bread will live forever. Now, when Jesus said, "This is the bread that came down from heaven," it is clear he's not talking about cannibalism, but transformation. Jesus always, as we know, challenged his listeners to go beneath the surface of their own assumptions, not just to understand his words, but in order to understand him. While some scholars have attempted to connect Jesus' words exclusively with the sacrament of communion, it is clear that, at least in John, this is not the only way we are to understand what he is saying. Rather, Jesus is contrasting what his listeners can have through faith in him, as opposed to what they can never have in this world. Humanity can never have enough food to nourish their bodies forever. Food sustains the body. But as Jesus said, the body still dies. Those who pursued Christ for the sake of miraculous bread believed that food was the only form of nourishment. And they had a right to think about that. Food was difficult sometimes to come by in the Roman Empire. So they had a right to think that. But Christ told them that true life was only possible by what he called true food. A true food that nourishes their souls. And in doing so, they who take of this true food would find a nourishing place for feasting upon God's love. And they would do that through Christ. The table that is before us this morning is that nourishing place. It is that place of nourishment where we share the only food and drink that sustains our humanity. The best of humanity, what it truly means, as Jesus showed us, to be human. Immersing ourselves into Christ as we do at the table is not a sacramental ritual. It is, the way I like to describe it, a spiritual offering to the glory of God, an offering of all that we are, all that we've been, and all that we will ever be. Christianity is not a buffet where we get to choose what we will do with our lives and with our faith. Rather, at this table, Christ chooses us in order to fill the world with his love. That is the purpose we discover when we come to this table. And that purpose transcends everything else in our lives. Our lives become nourishing places for those we love and those whom we serve. There is enough food on that table today to nourish everyone. Everyone. Not in this sanctuary, not those watching, but in the world to nourish everyone. Because God's love is unconditional and infinite. So this morning, you and I are invited to eat our fill at the table, that we may fill the empty in this world, the empty places, the empty people, the empty folks around us with good things. It is a nutritional place, this table. And we are called to feed the world from it, called to be God's people. Let us gather and feast.